It gives me great pleasure to kick off this evening's speaking event. As our practice with our 10 intensives every year, Friday, Saturday, Sunday for the MBA program, is to normally have a speaking engagement on Friday evening. And we invite all sorts of interesting people to come and tell us about their work. And it's usually connected to the purpose of the MBA program in some way, which is managing for sustainability. Tonight, we have David Bennell, and I'm going to say a couple of things about him quickly and then let him continue the introduction. But the first thing I want to say, before we even mention anything in his resume, is that I met David when he had been hired as a consultant to Marlboro College to begin to design this program. And that was before that's before I worked for Marlboro College. It was during the summer or maybe even late spring of 2006. And David was under contract with the college and with the direct involvement of the Board of Trustees and a variety of business people around here, most of whom had SVN, Social Venture Network connections, to come up with the idea of this MBA program. So David has a really long and deep perspective on the original reason for this program. He was part of the group that envisioned this program long before it even came into existence. And I happened to be working in Brattleboro for another organization, and so I was invited to be part of basically like a focus group that met several times to look at the need and the possible structure and curriculum and so forth of this program. So we really go way back to the inception of this program. And now David has been here a number of times since. He's a member of our circle of advisors. And he's remained an interested friend of the program all along. But this is really the first time David's had a chance to interact with students and faculty. You were here for one of the advisors meetings, and we speak from time to time, but it's really great to widen the sort of interface or the contact between David and us as a community. Just a couple of quick things about David. He's got a past with LL Bean and some other organizations which I can't remember right now. But then most recently, he was the executive director of the FSC, or Forest Stewardship Council Fund, which is a philanthropic organization that, among other things, helps to finance the activities of the Forest Stewardship Council. And then his most recent position as an employee has been as executive director of the erstwhile Organic Exchange, which became Textile Exchange, and he is now, he remains connected to Textile Exchange as a senior advisor, and that's his current role. He lives near, you live in Freeport, is that where you live, or near?
I live 6 miles from Dr. John Ehrenfeld.
Oh, that's right. You're no longer living in Maine, you're in Massachusetts.
No, I mean,
that Maine.
the better part of him.
The Maine area.
Yes.
Okay. So David, as well as John's Summerhouse residents, are in Maine, and I'm not going to make any more errors like that. Turn it over to you.
Thank you. Well, thanks, folks. When you commit to doing something like this on a Friday afternoon in late June, of course, you wonder why would anyone show up unless it was foggy and rainy. So, Mary actually had mentioned to me that many people might make the choice to go swimming at the river instead of coming to the presentation. So I'm actually quite pleased that it is like this, and I made her promise to tell me where the swimming spot is so I could go find you if you weren't in this room. With my bathing suit, by the way. Is it bathing suit optional, that kind of, because I am in Brattleboro. I just need to clarify. Yeah, okay, I thought so, yeah. That occurred to me as I said bathing suit. Some people are like, what the hell is a bathing suit? What would you use that for? I also know that I'm in the unenviable position, I think, of being the last thing in between you and either a drink or dinner or both, maybe a movie, maybe the theater. So I'll try and be as interesting, entertaining, and even concise as I can be. Having said that, there's an immense amount of power and intellect and passion in this room. You can't help but be affiliated with this program, or I would even venture to say the town of Brattleboro, without having some I think, something in your DNA that would have you interested in probably my topic, even though it has to do with the word textiles. And we'll get into But I'd like to invite a real dialogue. I'm not afraid of at all conflict or discourse, a difference of opinion. Some of you who I know pretty well, I have some other opinions and some other ideas. So yes, I've got the PowerPoint, and yes, I've given it before, so I think I can do a relatively okay job, but I'd actually like to really invite dialogue. And I'll talk about Textile Exchange, and I'll talk about why it exists, but I'm also going to try and weave in, because Ralph asked me to, some sort of personal insights for those of you that are in the MBA program about my career where it's appropriate. This isn't about David Bennell, it's actually about Textile Exchange and the bigger issue of why apparel and textiles and sustainability matter. So there's the basic context. So the invitation and the challenge to you is to not only stay awake, but really get engaged. And you can interrupt me, you can raise your hand, you can just, pretend we're Quakers and just say what you feel whenever you feel like it. And I'm very comfortable with that, and I really invite it. Can I ask, without asking everyone to say it, can I just ask several of you who might be on the extroverted side of the Myers-Briggs, tell me who you are and where you come from, so I can just get a sample of who's in the room. So, yes, sir.
I'll even start. I'm not part of your program, but I live here in West Brattleboro, and Marlene and I raise alpacas.
Okay.
So we have 45 acres, and we have alpacas. Now, our cottage industry, and as somebody you might know, Nick Hain, Alpaca United, he was involved in cotton for quite a while.
Huh.
And he's getting involved in textiles also.
Okay.
So we're looking into different ways of doing something with alpaca and, of course, textiles.
Perfect. Okay. Thanks. All right. Yes, sir.
Peter Kroll, faculty, and I wear clothes.
Exactly. Even when you're in Brattleboro.
Even in Brattleboro.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Hi.
I'm Nick Fairjack. I'm a prospective student here, and I actually work up in Burlington, Vermont at the food co-op.
Oh, good. Welcome. I've been in the co-op. Yeah.
I'm working on a hemp initiative called Hempfully Green to get building with hemp. And I'm also working on public banking so we can get organic money. I'm working in the political sphere to do that. I'm from Putney. My name is Emily King.
Great. Thanks, Emily.
And thank you, Ralph, for doing these things.
Yeah.
I'm Molly Ernst-Popper, and I'm part of this program. And I work for Phillips Van Heusen in the Global Human Rights and Social Responsibility.
Okay, here you go. You're taking the lavalier in my PowerPoint.
No.
Isn't there a Reebok person here, too? No?
Couldn't make it.
Okay.
She's in our program, Lindsay.
All right. See, she knew I was going to make her do the presentation. That's why she didn't come. Thank you. Yeah.
Kathleen Draper, I'm with the program as well, and we just got back from Malawi where we stayed at an non-organic cotton farm.
Okay. Perfect. Yeah.
Janice Warren from SRI World Group, and we have something called One Report, and we work with companies to synthesize these various frameworks and industry or otherwise into a technology platform.
Perfect. All right, unless you're one of those people who's going to regret not speaking up right now, one of those, if you're rehearsing what you're going to say and you're going to regret you didn't say who you are, I've been taught to count to 7 because I tend to be relatively extroverted. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Claire Wilson. I'm connected with a little spinning mill up in Putney, Vermont, Putney, right up the river,
Yeah.
that that spins organic wool, which is very hard to find.
Yep.
And has from the Vermont, which organization? I guess it's NOFA. Is certified to do organic processing of that wool.
Wow. So was Matt Mole someone that you worked with from Middlebury?
The name
Yep.
is familiar.
Yep.
I'm not the one that purchases the wool.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Yes.
I'm Bonnie Seawald. I'm in the MBA program, and because you brought up the spinning thing, I'm a knitter and I spin, and I also wear business suits in Washington, D.C., and I'm really sad that there aren't really any organically made business suits. So suiting is an interest. Changing the face of it.
I was in New York on Wednesday. It was 88 degrees with it. It had to have been 99% humidity in a gray flannel pinstripe suit, thinking, number one, I can't wait to get back to Maine, and I'm glad I don't live here anymore. But really the same thing. I mean, my God, this is just about as uncomfortable as I could be. And is there a different way to do this? Let alone the environmental and social impacts. Just the fact that the suit was made not for that sort of condition, yet there were all of these men and women dressed exactly like me, looking as miserable as me. So, So, okay, you have a sense of the collective wisdom of the group, so I'd just say let's try and leverage that. Yes, I've got the PowerPoint, but I mean, many of you are probably more expert in some of these areas than I am. I am not an organic expert. I know more than most lay people about it, but as I talk to you about sort of the transition from, as Ralph mentioned, from organic exchange to textile exchange, without leaving organic behind, by the way, by really moving it forward, by putting it in a greater context, we're still fully committed to organic. But just want to make sure if you go deep with me on organic certification, I'll probably put you in touch with somebody from Textile Exchange who is an expert and can take you where you want and need to go. Otherwise, it just make me cry because I never got that good at really deep organic farming practices. Other people at the organization, like Lorraine Pepper, who's the managing director, one of the foremost organic cotton farmers in the world, will hook you up. So let's leverage this group. I mean, you've got amazing expertise, and thank you, particularly for those of you, I think every one of you has come from somewhere other than this building. So thanks. And I also want to look directly at the MBA students and potential students and just say thank you. You're obviously bright people. The fact that you applied to or even considering or being considered by Marlboro says that you've got a lot of smarts and I think a lot of passion, which also means you probably have a fair amount of choice even in this economy. And I would just say up front, I really need to thank you as a professional and someone who's been in this business not quite as long as some others, who might be more veteran and expert than me, but I think probably would second. I'm looking at John and Ralph and the others in the room who have been in this field for a long, long time. We need you, and I just really want to say thank you because I know you have choice, and I love the fact that you've committed to this. And I hope by the end of my presentation, if you're not already convinced, you think of this as really good 21st century business practice. So Textile Exchange, what is it and why am I standing in front of you? I'm going to take you through some stuff that you're very familiar with, so I'll probably fast forward through a couple of slides because you know all this stuff. Some other things I put in here because I want to go deep on a couple of things. So you'll see things on product development, voice of the customer, voice of the stakeholder, lead user, early adopter stuff, because I wanted to go deep in a couple of areas, particularly because I know a majority of you are involved in the MBA program and you're studying this sort of stuff. And then some other things, again, I'll sort of wax over pretty quickly. So if you have any questions, if I didn't go deeply enough on some things you are really interested in, I'll leave you with my phone number and my email address, and please feel free, or I'll be staying after for at least an hour after I'm done. Just hit me up and we can go deep and wide as we can. Fair enough? So I am the former executive director of Textile Exchange. I have now resigned. I can go into those reasons afterwards, but pretty much for lifestyle reasons. I spend a lot of the time out of the country doing, I think, really valuable work. But from a personal perspective, trying to raise a healthy family, I found the commitment I made to work in the sustainability field internationally incompatible with living the kind of sustainable lifestyle I wanted to lead. I was a lousy husband, a lousy parent of 2 sons, a lousy community member, a lousy friend, a lousy athlete. I was committed to the sustainability profession, but my life was completely out of whack. Primarily because I spent approximately 3 months of every year, give or take, out of the country. Hard to be any of those things I mentioned when you're not around. So I've made a decision to move out of this field and pause for a little bit, in large part because there's just immense talent at Textile Exchange that were perfectly primed and ready to take it to the next step. So you're actually my last formal Textile Exchange function, because as of July 7th, my formal relationship with them ends, although I'll remain fully committed to them forever because I think it's such a good idea. So here's what the thing is, and again, we can go wherever you want to go. If you think about the model of Textile Exchange, the idea is very straightforward. How can we put together, in many cases, arch rival competitors? The examples I always use are Nike, Adidas, and Puma are 3 of the members of Textile Exchange. And if any of you watched the World Cup last summer, you couldn't help but see commercials from each of those companies. let's just say they're vicious competitors. However, they come together in places like Textile Exchange and they work cooperatively to take certain things to scale. They do it very carefully, but they do it, if not with the blessing of their general counsel, they do it with the approval of their company. And there are many, many other examples all over the supply chain or value chain of these sorts of things. So if you think about the idea of sort of a multi-stakeholder, competitor-friendly environment, that's what really we tried to create. It was actually founded by Patagonia and Nike, because both companies, Patagonia had made a 100% organic cotton commitment in 1996, and Nike was making its own commitment to organic cotton. And they found each other and recognized that those two companies alone would use up almost every piece of organic fiber in the world if they didn't figure out how to take it to scale. So fast forward now, and we're at, bigger than the GDP of France if you combine last year's net sales of the membership of this organization. We're not $800 billion as an organization. But think about that. I mean, if you put together all of the net sales, aggregated them from 2010, it's bigger than the GDP of France. That's scale. Now, do we get everybody to line up and fly like beautiful butterflies in the same direction all the time? Hell no. But this is really powerful stuff if we can make a dent in some of the issues that we're really committed to trying to make a difference in. This is the kind of scale that I think can get to really interesting change. We have staff in 8 countries, and for those of you that are very interested in organics, organic cotton, organic wool, and others, we did start with organic cotton. It was about a $200 million business at the early part of the last decade. We're over $4 billion now. So that's a 40% annualized growth rate over 8 years or more. I just did that in my head, so that may be wrong. But let's just say I wouldn't mind owning a company that had that kind of growth rate. So it's a good idea, and the model was one that's pretty interesting and has been replicated by groups like the Better Cotton Initiative, the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, and many others. I think it was Da Vinci or somebody, I stand on the shoulders of giants, and in many ways we just interpreted and then modified some of the great models that had come before us, and guess what? People are iterating on our model and doing it better themselves in different places. You're probably very familiar with other kinds of multi-stakeholder approaches. For various reasons, and I'll go into them and you'll see it in this slide deck, we're moving into other sustainable textiles, really because our membership has told us to. H&M about 2 years ago said, literally, you've taught us everything we know about organic cotton, but we're not just about organic cotton anymore, H&M speaking. We need you to create the place and space where we can go and create scale about all the other fibers and materials we need to get greener. So we heard that enough times, and we had to do something about it. And the other thing that happened, and I'll show you in the deck, is that organic cotton had gotten about as far as we're going to get it in its sort of existing model. And we needed to place it in a bigger context so that we could grow from 4 billion to hopefully 10 billion maybe by the end of this next decade. You'll see a list of companies up here, and you can see the breakdown down there, or maybe you can't from the back. But we are, with the exception of Antarctica, I think we're in every continent. You know all these brands, and I just put it up here. These are about 24 of our brands. There are many others that aren't up here that are, very, very interesting. But I tend to have to put this one up wherever I am in the world because people go, oh, well, maybe I ought to listen to this guy. He may not know anything, but the people that he works with certainly do and are doing either interesting things or should be compelled to do more interesting things. So that's just a sample. But what I like about this slide is that you do see that certainly in terms of Europe and North America, most of the top apparel and retail brands, particularly home textile and apparel brands, are members of ours. You're studying all this stuff. Many of you are leading in many of these areas, and I'm sorry it's probably pretty washed out. But so we don't need to go into a review of the mega trends that are really impacting all the things that are going on worldwide in business. But textiles and apparel really hadn't been paid attention to until recently. And some of the data that I'll show you, and it's backed up, I've got all the references, I just don't put them on the slide deck, we're really just discovering. Food, forests, other forms of agriculture, huge issues, and we've made some real progress. But textiles, you can argue why, but because we don't eat them, who knows, haven't really been paid attention to until recently, and that really is the raison d'etre for Textile Exchange's existence. We want to bring these issues to light and affect change that not only helps our members become more profitable, but get to profitability in a way that we think people will better appreciate, is probably the nicest way I can put it. I love profitability. I just care deeply about how companies get to profit. Again, you may know this, but maybe you've not seen it laid out this starkly, but if you think about why in the context of textiles and fabrics this matters, just break this down. And we could be talking about widgets. We could be talking about corn. We could be talking about forest products. But, pick an arbitrary date. Sometime in the last century, 54 resources were abundant. Well, now they're not. Talent was local. Talent is global. Innovation top-driven. Boy, if you're not innovating everywhere within the organization, you are in a 19th century, I'd be generous calling you a 20th century model. People were compliant. Well, I hope I was never compliant, but I'm sure I was. I started my career at Microsoft, moved to REI, and then LL Bean. I'm sure I was compliant because that's what you have to do in big organizations oftentimes to get things done and to get ahead. But I also hope I was creative. But now, I have to tell you, in my experience, particularly with some of these bigger brands, they're really trying to break out of that sort of didactic, top-down driven thing to really get innovation everywhere from within the company. And technology was changing, and guess what? It's still changing. Now, this is overlaid in the textile concept, but again, you can apply this to anything in your career. Growing number of people want to know what's in your product. Is it safe to make and use? Who made it, where, and under what conditions? I mean, when we're wearing gray flannel in D.C. and New York and just feeling uncomfortable or wondering why we couldn't make a purchase that was more sort of viable, both environmentally, economically, and socially, that's pretty sophisticated even to think about that. But what's happening now is more and more people are actually, if you look at my wife, who fits a really interesting demographic, she's like the LL Bean demographic. We have a household income that kind of fits the LL Bean or Patagonia model. She's got a advanced degree, blah, 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 blah. When she found out that the government of Uzbekistan has a policy on the books where they enslave children every fall to pick cotton, it's a government policy. She was horrified because we buy a lot of the brands that buy their cotton off the Bremen Cotton Exchange, where Uzbeki cotton goes in and is blended with other cotton. And she found this out when our youngest was about 5 or 6 years old and our oldest was about 9 or 10. So, my wife and I were thinking, these are our children, if you will, spiritually, that are enslaved in the 21st century by a government to pick cotton that goes into the clothing that our children, unbelievably privileged that they are wearing. We care deeply about that, and we can find out about it instantaneously now. Is it safe to make and use? I mean, sorry, that Nalgene bottle, enough said about plastic. These are things that John and I and others were working on a decade ago, and finally these sorts of things are breaking, and they're breaking at times with sort of mock speed, not always with good data, but always with a fair amount of passion. And so people are more and more engaged about, is it safe to use products? Is it safe to wear the products? What does it mean when I scoot my bum along that chair and it slightly abrades and I inhale that? Do people think about these things? The primary way that you get shrink reduced in cotton is to apply a formaldehyde resin treatment of about 18%. Over about 50 washings, that's reduced to about 6 or 7%. Anybody take high school science class? Yeah. Any of you ever have to dissect a frog? You know what formaldehyde is. It's highly volatile carcinogen. And if you're wearing cotton, I can guarantee that you're wearing formaldehyde. I could go on. By the end of this thing, you're going to hate the fact that Ralph invited me here, because I'm one of those freaks who knows the stuff that you don't want to know. Yeah. Who made it, where, under what conditions? A colleague of John's at MIT, Dara O'Rourke, is the one who, in Vietnam, discovered people chained to machines making sneakers, and on and on and on and on. Yes?
I apologize, I missed that first part of
To keep it from shrinking and wrinkling.
Wow.
Yeah. So if you wondered, these treatments that are used that are very sophisticated, and it's not the only thing that's used, but typically it's a formaldehyde resin that is applied to cotton to keep it from shrinking. Because cotton will shrink, cotton shrinks at a huge amount depending on what kind of cotton and how it's manufactured, finished. So yeah, typically, if you didn't know this, the way that we keep your cotton clothing from shrinking is we douse it with formaldehyde, among other wonderful things. Now you're beginning to understand, I think, just by that one story. And when I talk about textiles, I'm talking about the chair you're sitting on, the carpet your feet are on. There aren't any draperies in here, but I'm talking about your sheets. I'm talking about everything that you swaddle your babies in and your grandparents in. And this stuff is serious stuff. So anyway, this one you can't read it, but it takes about 1/3 of a pound of chemistry applied to cotton fields to produce conventional cotton. Herbicides, fungicides, insecticides, etc. And the industry's gotten much, much better about reducing those quantities because it's more efficient and cheaper to, just be smart about the use of materials, but also because people care about what's in their product, where it was made, under what conditions, etc. So the industry, from a cotton perspective, is doing much better than ever about using its resources intelligently, in large part driven by business reasons, and included in that, I would say, driven by the knowledge that you have as a consumer to say, I want you to change cotton, because I'm not comfortable now that I understand how cotton is manufactured, how it's grown, how it's picked, how it's dyed, how it's finished, how it's cut and sewn. More and more information makes a more and more informed consumer base, and companies are responding to this. Oops, sorry about that. And again, all this stuff, but even if you don't read the top, read the bottom if you can read it. It says, the day we discovered targeting brands was like the day we discovered gunpowder. And that comment was made by a Greenpeace campaigner in 2004. The day we discovered targeting brands was like the day humans discovered gunpowder. Very sophisticated statement. And it just happens to be attributed to Greenpeace, and it was probably said by somebody else, right? Didn't Plato said there's no such thing as an original thought, and he probably stole that from Sophocles, right? So these sorts of things have been, but the fact that this is being used so effectively now, instead of going to the courts, sort of the 1970s model, we've jumped to going directly to the people that really, really matter, and those are the people that are buying stuff, and letting them know that the Uzbeki government, enslaves about 300,000 children every year to pick cotton. That's a big deal for Dee Dee Bennell and David Bennell, who can make some choices about where they shop. That particular story broke over the Gap, Timberland, and a couple other brands. So it was an incredibly sophisticated outing of the issue, not by saying in this sort of press conference, Uzbekistan does this. They said, the Acme company colludes in the enslavement of children, and here's the proof. Very sophisticated and very well executed. So anyway, all this other stuff, right? Stakeholder environmental activity continues to move upstream, and this is sort of the, I wouldn't say this is a 70s, 80s, 90s, 21st century approach, but it does kind of flow through what you can look through as you study in your MBA, the last 30 to 40 years of what I would call stakeholder activism. And in this case, I have the word environmental, but you could say it was social as well. So for those of us old enough to, you can get it on Netflix, to remember the movie Field of Dreams, there was this scene in there where Shoeless Joe Jackson, right, this apparition appears and tells Kevin Costner's character to build a baseball diamond in a cornfield in Iowa. And Kevin Costner's like, I must have drunk some bad moonshine. I mean, who is this apparition? Why are you telling me this? And long story short, metaphorically, Shoeless Joe Jackson, who died in the 20s, says, if you build this field, they will come. And for many of us that have built product over the years, we thought, because we were experts, we'd done our research, we were good designers, we were good developers, we had good sourcing organizations, and we had good brands. We thought if we sort of put it out there, customers will come. Well, guess what? That's not necessarily the case anymore. right? Let me tell you a story that I think will illustrate this. Years ago, at one of the companies I worked for, we decided that we really wanted to own the women's active outerwear market for winter apparel. And most of the people who made that decision and worked on designing those programs looked like Ralph and me. Now, there's a fundamental problem, I think, with that, right? And you're all pretty women in the room are laughing and chuckling. So imagine when we started down this road and we began to understand that, well, number one, I don't really know anything about what a woman really needs or wants in an active outdoor winter program, right? So long story short, we went out and we did lots of really interesting sort of ethnography and cultural anthropology work, and we discovered what we thought were some unmet needs about women's outerwear. And the people who did that research and the people who ended up designing the product, actually we handed it over to the appropriate people who should do that, and that was a group of women. So when we did these interviews, though, so we finally got that straight, and we got women designers designing women's apparel, duh. But the second thing we did that I think was brilliant is we really listened to consumers, and here's what we found. Women didn't necessarily want a particular color, or if you push things down and sort of really brought it down to the core essential element of what a woman wanted out of a overstuffed, warm winter jacket. Does anybody have any idea what that would be? If you had to use one design attribute for a women's insulated outerwear parka or jacket, what would that one attribute be?
Slimming.
That's exactly the word.
Right on.
Ralph, I wouldn't have necessarily gotten that. So, I mean, we interviewed Olympic athletes. We interviewed. It was really, so this idea that back in the day we experts would know has completely, really, literally flown out the window. And the fact that primarily white men would be designing things for the world has also, I hope, the opportunity for it to fly out the window exists. Whether or not it's completely out the window, I think we know the answer to that one. But yeah, but I could talk to you all day long about, well, stakeholder activity really drives this stuff. But I mean, there are many, many, many different drivers that are really affecting change. And that one's huge. Slimming. I mean, we didn't interview Peekaboo Street, and Lindsey Vonn wasn't around back then. But I mean, we interviewed a couple of unbelievably fit women Olympians who said the same thing that the woman in my neighborhood who walks her dog every morning, who's now in her 70s, said. And that was our number one design attribute. We can make it whatever, we can make it the color story right, we can get the insulation right, but if it doesn't do something, as women said, I'll bring this down quickly, I don't want to look like the Stay Puft Marshmallow Woman. It was like this aha moment, and it may not seem like an aha thing, but we built some of those programs and then had the problem you want. We just couldn't keep up with demand, like 274% of our forecast, with just that slight but unbelievably potent change in mindset. And again, here's where I'm going to go a little bit deep on the product development stuff, just because I think it's really important. There was a Product Development and Management Association study that showed that about 80% of new product development cost and complexity occurs during the design stage of anything. I'm not talking about clothing. Think about that. If you front-end load, which you do in design, your attributes, I don't care how good your sourcing organization is about going around the world and beating people up for pennies on the dollar. 80% of cost and complexity is designed in at the front end. When I met John, I was an adjunct faculty person at MIT working in the Aero-Astra department to help, it was a 5-year program, and they were teaching kind of this idea in the 5th year, right? Instead of teaching it up front. You'd think that if we're going to teach people how to build things, we might teach them how to build things the right way early in their program. And so they flipped it because, and I'm oversimplifying this is really true. If at the early stage you're not making the correct decisions, and I mean economic, environmental, and social decisions, you can't source your way out of it or market your way out of it. And this has been proven. I'd love to take this idea, and here's a case study for MBA students. do the environmental and social analysis of this. Is it 80% of environmental burden is designed? I bet, maybe it's 69%, depending on, maybe it's 99%, but what an interesting thing to challenge, right? This other stuff you'd say is relatively intuitive, but slimming, we didn't get it. We didn't get it until we really started to go in, and of course, customers have this nasty habit of not telling you what they really want, right? If I interview Beth and I ask her what she wants in a sweater because she knows she might go from a warm, it's not warm today, but warm Vermont night into an air-conditioned office building, what kind of wrap would you like to, she might say, well, one that's, light, and but, it's really hard for her, as good as she is at probably articulating herself, for her to solve my problems as a product developer. So these things are huge, really driving upstream this idea that we really get into the stakeholder environment and live and work with them in their end-use area. And then this one is huge, and if you haven't studied this yet, another colleague of John's from MIT, Eric von Hippel, coined the term lead user. But this is where I think a lot of really interesting research is going to come from an environmental and social standpoint. If you believe in this concept, going out and collecting the voice of the stakeholder and understanding the key influencers of your business will be key, and companies are terrible at this. They're just getting good at trying to understand and bring technology to discovering the voice of the customer, but they're not necessarily thinking about all those other stakeholders and collecting that voice. Think of the innovation. Think of the innovation potential. If you really engaged with, just to pick on them since they're already up on the screen, a Greenpeace at a deep level, could you be finding some really new, interesting new business ideas? And absolutely. But, and I'm picking on Greenpeace. At this point in most companies, Greenpeace is still the organization that most CEOs and others would think are going to end up on your smokestack or rappelling from the side of your building, not necessarily in the C-suite office or out in the end-use environment with your customers, working collaboratively with you. Let's flip that one on its head. Maybe not with Greenpeace, maybe with somebody else. But I think that's the sort of maturity that we're really striving for in business now, this idea that we are really only going to solve these problems if we do sort of undo some of the thinking we've had in the past. Just here's another one that sort of illustrates the 80% thing. You reduce time to market, you'll reduce your costs, and you'll reduce your mistakes if you really do start to drive this idea of integrating the voice of the customer, the voice of the stakeholder earlier into, right, your product development process. Just to show you it a bit differently graphically. And to quote Eric, I think these are really interesting. Think about Gary Fisher, who kind of perfected the idea of the mountain bike. He didn't set out to build something called a mountain bike. He wanted to ride up and down Mount Tam in Marin County. So he modified an old Schwinn or a Huffy or whatever the hell it was. Jog bras, Gatorade, rollerblades. These were all designed by people who were way ahead of the market. They just had a problem, or they had an idea, and they went out and solved it. And look where that's gone. So this idea that you can find these people who are oftentimes predictive of some really interesting market opportunities is, again, where kind of Textile Exchange likes to help companies play. So really sort of an interesting thing that happens for us at Textile Exchange is some companies come in as members. They may not say it this way, but this is what they're looking for. They really are looking for an engagement with the stakeholder community that might help them uncover some unmet needs because of the lead user, early adopter aspect. Pretty cool stuff. And if you don't know anything about the lead user concept, it's just really almost as straightforward as this, although Dr. von Hippel would want you to, he'd really want you to know the deep complexity that comes here, but this is the one that I think is essential in this point. Ignoring the voice of the stakeholder can lead to all kinds of interesting lost opportunities. Just ask CocaCola, who maybe 10 years ago weren't talking about water as a clear top 5 strategic issue or even a material issue for the company. When in India they couldn't build one of their plants because Indian stakeholders in the community were worried about their aquifer being depleted. Among many, many other examples of that particular company really beginning to listen to the stakeholders and interpret what stakeholders were saying and apply it to the business, you ignore the voice of the stakeholder at your own peril. Because guess what? If you're Poland Spring trying to build a plant in Maine, jobs and taxes don't work anymore. Wait a minute. There are going to be how many semi-trailers going by 24/7 my house? What about my well? What about, I mean, these are, it ain't about jobs and taxes anymore. From a design perspective, I love this quote because it basically says the environmental crisis is a design issue. And if you talk to people like Bill McDonough and others that are very active in design, even a Stella McCartney, they may say it differently, but this sort of gestalt thing really exists, that we make bad design decisions, and if 80% of cost, quality, and burden really is designed in at the front end, please, MBA students, community members, faculty members, think about how important it is to move your thinking and applying your knowledge way up front in whatever product or service you're involved in making. Because this is really where you're going to make a difference. Yes, you can work in sourcing and make an impact, but this is really where we're seeing in Textile Exchange, really where we're trying to move to. And here's what it looks like in terms of our moving, just to go deep into Textile Exchange for a minute. So back in the day when I was at LLB in the late 90s, if I wanted to green this shirt, really the only choice I had was organic cotton. There really weren't many other material options out there. And so you see this sort of bigger purple circle on the left-hand side of your screen. Sustainability was a very, niche is almost too light of a word. It was a very niche activity in most companies. And organic was a clear option for cotton. Not the only one, but it is a bit of a safe harbor in a storm, organic cotton, if you're talking about trying to improve cotton. Now, there are many other options now, but let's fast forward to the bigger story. This was made by a brand that you're very familiar with, by the VP of sourcing from a brand. It was made in 2009. Now, I think you remember business in 2009. It was really crummy. We were very close to another depression. Certainly we're in a deep recession. And yet this senior VP of sourcing at a name brand was under immense pressure to green her whole supply chain. Gone were the days when organic cotton was the only option for a company. And I mean from a sustainability perspective. People weren't thinking about building envelopes. They weren't thinking about carbon. They were thinking, if they thought about green, they were thinking about product. And if they thought about product and they worked in cotton, it was organic. It was about the only option. Fast forward 5 years, 10 years, and it's really the whole thing. I need integrated solutions as a company. I don't know this for a fact, but I've heard rumor that the CEO of Walmart has on his performance appraisal up to 5 different attributes that you might look and say, those are sustainability attributes. Whether that's true or not, whether Mike Duke does or doesn't have on his bonus matrix or performance review, things that you might point to and say, wow, that's a sustainability performance metric. The fact is, that which gets measured gets done, and we're seeing much more of this integrated into business at a very high level. And so for organic cotton, we had to get really smart about, so where do we fit now? Where do we fit now? It's not the only solution. In fact, we're competing against all kinds of other company priorities under the sustainability header. So we started to think deeply about, okay, if not just organic cotton, well, what else do we do? And this is what we started to uncover. I mean, you know about the 9 billion people by 2050, and these are the major issues, by the way: waste, water, energy, toxics, climate, and biodiversity. When you think about textiles, waste, water, energy, toxics, climate, and biodiversity. And by the way, we'll leave this slide here so you have the deck. These are the real impacts that, when you think about textiles, that we find. These are the sorts of things, and I'll go through these kind of quickly, and I will leave the deck with you again, but 3/4 of the 1.2 billion people who live on less than $1 a day, work and live in rural areas. Typically, if they're making any income at all, much of it is associated to agriculture. And of course, agriculture is key in the fight against poverty. So if we start to think again about just the impact on people, we knew that we had to do some things that were beyond organic cotton. There were about 250, let's see if I can get this right, 250,000 organic cotton farmers in the world. About 1.1 million people a year are impacted by the work of Textile Exchange in the organic, in the organic sector. That's not bad. I feel very good that our work impacts 1 million people. About 250,000 farms, on average about 4 to 5 people work on a farm You can average it out. It's about 1 million plus. That's great. But I think there are about 250 million people worldwide that work in cotton. So we're barely 1%. Barely 1%. Organic cotton is about 1% of the cotton, of global cotton demand. So again, if we really want to have the kind of impact we want to have and need to have, we had to move not away from organic cotton, but put it in a different context. Have you ever heard this one or thought about this one? 5% on average of landfill is textiles. I don't care if you're talking about Guatemala City or Brattleboro or Moscow. You know, if you go in and, you know, if you're an archaeologist 400 years from now, you're going to see a lot of the stuff is textile related. I don't know what 5% of the Brattleboro landfill looks like, but
So what would that be, textile related? What kind of waste?
clothing, carpeting, draperies,
Just
couches.
literally. Okay.
Yep. Yep. Yeah.
I think in Brattleboro they're actually starting to collect clothes and shoes now to make carpets and do that.
Yep. Well, the model, well, you'll see some other things in here that, you know, the model of, the whole model is being exploded. In my deck, I'm just showing, look, you know, if you haven't thought about your clothing, if you haven't thought about your drapes, if you haven't thought about your sheets and where they go, yes, they hopefully go to Goodwill or they go to the Salvation Army, but eventually they will end up in some landfill or transfer station incinerator somewhere. And the data that we've discovered basically says that, yeah, about 5% of, on average, of landfill space is textiles. So there is no way it goes somewhere eventually. When you give it to Goodwill, that's great, but you know, it will end up somewhere in the earth or in the air. You know, this is a really interesting one that we wrestle with, and we can talk about this later, but our companies and our staff wrestle with this all the time because, you know, is organic better than conventional? Is recycled polyester better than virgin polyester? Is rayon better than polyethylene? And you have to do all kinds of very deep life cycle analysis, and then you have to study, as John has done in industrial ecology, who did the work, who paid for the work, how valid is the research, and these are incredibly complex issues. But let me show you some of the things that sort of exemplify what I'm talking about. If I'm Nike, or if I'm a European manufacturer who, by law, if I'm a British manufacturer, I have to quantify and disclose my carbon emissions now by law. So back to that 80% of cost and burden come at the design stage. And I've got to produce beautiful outerwear. I never thought about environmental anything before, really. Now I've got to think about, okay, if I look at the greenhouse gas emission profile of the kind of different choices I might have to build an outerwear product. My company has told me as a designer, I didn't go to design school to learn about this, but they're telling me now that we have a corporate goal to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 15% by 2015. And I'm now metriced on that. I start looking into this stuff and I say, oh my God, you know, nylon 6 has this burden, polyester has this burden. I'm starting to make some decisions that I never ever made before, and they're absolutely about environmental. They're absolutely about environment. Believe me, for those of you that are studying in the Marlboro MBA program, you probably made this program your choice for a reason. I can guarantee you that most people are not taught this and will not be taught this sort of thing for years. But most people in my world, many people in my world are already having to discover how to do this sort of stuff. And you're not necessarily trained at the Fashion Institute of Technology, I won't pick on, or anywhere where people go to study textiles. You're not trained in any of this stuff. So there's now additional pressure, not only on-time delivery, cost, and quality, the holy grail of product development, right? But this stuff? I'm supposed to know the carbon profile of nylon versus polyester versus... It's really getting intense out there in my industry. It's fascinating to watch it unfold. Yeah.
Would you mind just reading down the far edge?
Oy, oy, oy.
Do you still find it?
why don't I make sure that you get a copy of it? Because we could be here for an hour and a half if I go into all of this. But the point is that product developers, sourcing engineers, and others are having to think about environmental impacts in ways that they hadn't even thought of 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago, driven by a number of factors that you're all familiar with. So the idea that business isn't paying attention to some of this, or the smarter business, throw that one out the window. Many people are absolutely designing with an eye toward this right now. It takes about 700 gallons of fresh water to make one cotton t-shirt. One cotton t-shirt. From growing the cotton to producing the, one cotton t-shirt. In 2009, the world used 3 trillion gallons of fresh water. Now, let me tell you, I told you you'd be squirming by the end, and I've been kind to you, but now I'm going to make you squirm a bit. This is the operative word here, fresh. We design chemistry so stupidly that they need fresh water to work, and reaction agents. And so, in many cases, in the places I've been in the world, I've watched the fabric I'm working on get cleaner water than the people that are making the fabric. And I got to tell you, it doesn't go out the way it came in. You go to a denim plant, and I won't pick on any country, and there's a reason why the rivers are indigo blue. So, from a moral standpoint, this is huge. It takes 3 trillion gallons of fresh water. And we're in a global water crisis already in many areas of the world. Huge issues. I don't even know what 3 trillion means. But I know the concept of that's got to be fresh water, because we design things so stupidly. They can't be, these things we're wearing can't be made from wastewater, because we make the chemistries and the reaction agents and the dye stuffs so dumb that they need fresh water to work. This is the thing I already mentioned. The water is the main ingredient in every product. CocaCola just disclosed this, in the last 4 to 5 years in its 10K. So if those of you studying this sort of stuff, and I'm not picking on Coke, I'm just saying, look, the first ingredient in Coca-Cola is water. And up until the last decade or so, they may have been working on it, but it wasn't disclosed. So if you're studying things like the Prudent Investor Act and the issue of materiality, these are huge material issues. And as a shareholder, as a business person, as an owner, as a manager, I would say, you are absolutely obligated to be thinking about these things and working on them for this very reason. Forget that it's the right thing to do. These are material issues. And you're required, whether it's a privately held company or a publicly traded company, I'd suggest to you, particularly in the publicly traded world, of course, that if it's an issue that's material, you have to be working on it. But here's one of the iconic brands, usually trading 1 or 2 with one of the other brands, the iconic global brand in the world, who is finally just in the last decade saying our number 1 ingredient is a major material issue for us, and we have now explicit programs that take this into consideration, and we will forever. Recycled is really, we lose about $30 billion of value in this country alone because we don't recycle, looking for one, PET, 27%. There are 2 plants that I'm aware of in China, and again, I don't mean to pick on a particular country. There are 2 plants that we know of that produce bottles, and on the same facility, chip the bottles, melt it down, pelletize it, and sell it as recycled polyester. Smart stuff. Morally, we won't even go there. But recycled polyester is so valuable on the market, there are at least 2 places that I'm aware of that have been created to bypass the whole recycling stream. Smart stuff if you can get away with it. We'll talk later offline when I'm not being recorded. Okay, the good stuff, and this. There are some really interesting alternatives. We won't go down the ethanol road, but there are some really interesting viable alternatives. I'm sure if you go over to the co-op across the street and you get a cup, not this cup that I got with coffee in it, but a plastic cup for soda, it's probably made from corn or some other kind of starch-based product. So, we are starting to go down this road, which is pretty exciting, but it creates its own issues. Do we use corn to feed people who don't have enough food, or we use corn to make the carpeting that your feet are on. Again, back to the textile industry, we think approximately 10% of greenhouse gas emissions can be directly tied to some sort of textile or apparel production globally. Whether or not that's the agriculture growing the cotton, I know, who knows whether this data is absolutely right, but the point is that no one really knows what the numbers are. If you combine the agricultural impacts, the carbon generated from agriculture all the way through production, it's somewhere. This is the data we found. Whether or not it's right or real, I think it's too early to tell because these studies haven't been done. The one on the top is approximately right, and I can't tell you what 1 trillion kilowatt hours used means, but it sure sounds like a lot to me. And if I'm running a textile plant, I'm incentivized to get those numbers down. Forget again whether or not I think it has any environmental or social benefit. So the good news is that most people are incentivized to reduce these numbers. I read somewhere recently that in Europe alone, just with energy efficiency alone, you can get an IRR of about 16% if you attack, and you can capture about somewhere between 15 and 25% of the energy efficiency value in a company and get an IRR of about 16% just by tightening things up. And that'll outperform, that IRR of 16% just from efficiency gains will outperform most other kinds of profitability, hurdle rates, whatever other measure you want to use. Now that's not sustainable because once you capture those efficiencies and close that gap, you've closed the gap. But man, I would love to get 10% of whatever I could say Walmart or Tesco or Carrefour or Inditex. I could retire young. Well, I'm still relatively young. That's good business. 20% of industrial freshwater pollution comes from textile treatment and dyeing. Of the 83 chemistries and dyestuffs typically used in textiles, 32 are so toxic they can't be removed from wastewater even using the most state-of-the-art wastewater treatment. I talked to you about dumb stuff. We're using stuff that's so toxic, almost 3 dozen of it can never be removed from the waste stream. Isn't this kind of madness? Isn't this kind of crazy? Of the 80-plus inputs we tend to put into, 30 are so toxic we don't even have any technology to get it out. Well, it's going somewhere. Typically going somewhere in places that don't look like Brattleboro. It's really kind of just a fundamentally flawed model, wouldn't you say? So some interesting things, I'm looking at the clock, interesting things that are happening. Again, you're very familiar with this stuff. Companies are becoming more and more transparent and disclosing more and more, partly because of things like materiality and partly because we as investors are demanding it, but also because they're finding out that they can better manage the business. Nike, you might have seen last year, disclosed the 700 factories and plants that they're active in around the world. When Dara O'Rourke was working with his project in the late 1990s, Nike had somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 mills and factories, I think, around the world that their product was being made in. But like many companies at the time, and not to pick on Nike, they didn't even know where some of them were. Now they know where everyone is and they disclose it. Interesting stuff. And if you forget everything I said tonight, one of the things I'd really encourage you to find, and Verizon, I know at least Verizon made it available, there was a great article in the Harvard Business Review last year, spring of 2010. The article I wish I'd written called Leadership in the Age of Transparency. And it really hammers home this idea from a business perspective. This is the Harvard Business Review. It's not touchy-feely. It's a very hard-hitting business article that I think just sums it up beautifully. I wish I'd written the article. So these aren't dumb companies. We just haven't necessarily thought about natural resources in the same way we think about so many other things. So we'll go in and do that sort of consultative process. We'll go in and do these sorts of things, not unlike I'm doing today. We'll sort of take the information that we gain and try and make it viral. Again, about 210 to 215 members. We'll spread it out among the membership, but we'll also disclose it on the website and try and make it sort of common and available to people. Think about the sort of Linux model. We'll try and make it open source. We try and take the best learning we can find and frankly evaluate it and add some value to it, not put just sort of, pardon me, but crap out on the web because we found some new information, but try and really I'll call it vet it, and then broadcast it. We'll do 2 market reports every year, one on organic cotton and one on the broader area of sustainable textiles. Those are both due out this summer. We now own one of the 2 certifications worldwide for recycled materials. So whether you're Michelin and you want to make a claim about the recycled polyester belt on one of your tires, or whether or not you're Nike, all of the Nike kits, all the jerseys that were worn by the Nike sponsored team in the World Cup were made from recycled polyester, or at least the US one was. So, again, we're trying to think way beyond organic cotton, place organic cotton squarely in the broader context of sustainable textiles. And so we've moved into these other areas that really require business to work on the product integrity of textiles in a way that they haven't done before, by really even using language like product integrity and value chain and challenging people to think much more deeply about these concepts than they have before. And if you think about just the concept of integrity, I think about integrity sort of as over quality. And then if you tie in things like corporate responsibility and this other language we tend to use, there are now positions like at REI, Kevin Mayette, at Mountain Equipment Co-op, at Guyam, and some other really forward-facing companies whose title is Director or Vice President of Product Integrity. These used to be the quality assurance people, or people like me. So isn't that interesting? I mean, companies are beginning to sort of internalize this idea that integrity, whatever it means, and it means different things to different companies, but the idea that this concept of integrity is real and needs to be managed quite well. So I'm going to make a prediction, and that is that this idea of product integrity, I don't think it'll ever be total quality management, but I think we're going to see much more about this over time, both from academia and from practices in business. So I think it's so important. It sort of encapsulates all the things we've talked about and all the things we work on at Textile Exchange, like transparency, like smart design, like smarter materials, like using the strength of scale and the abilities of scale to get companies to work cooperatively to make change. Oh, here it is. This one's huge. I mean, if you think about, I don't know if any of you know the name Rich Learoff, but he's one of the people out there, former WWF person, who is working very hard on the TSCA. I can't remember the full words in the acronym, but the Toxics Control Act. There are 3,000, right? 3,000 chemistries in this country, and that's it, that are listed. Of the 34,000 to 100,000 that are available, only approximately 3,000 were actually ever tested and disclosed on our federal register. So this is the kind of thing where if you start thinking about this, okay, wait a minute, I've just taught you that formaldehyde is used as an anti-shrink and anti-wrinkle agent in your clothing. I highly recommend next time you buy a cotton product, you go home and wash it before you wear it. There are many instances where, if you think about these big container units that are used, think about the way that clothing is manufactured and then shipped. We use all this chemistry on it, then we wrap it in a polyethylene bag. What's used as a slip agent in the production of polyethylene bags? Anybody have any idea? Formaldehyde. So, okay, we produce these things with formaldehyde, then we wrap it in formaldehyde, and then we put it in think about this stuff. So, again, a very broken model, lots of opportunity for business, lots of money to be made in the solutions over time, and maybe some of you will become gazillionaires from some really interesting solutions. And then we talk about, what we're really talking about tonight. I mean, how do you begin to mainstream this stuff into your business? Do you have a strategy? What are the key initiatives that you use to improve and measure the environmental impact of your business, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And that way, we're not McKinsey or KPMG, but we do sort of basic business consulting, sustainability consulting that almost have nothing to do with the fact that we're in the textile business. It's sort of basic, good sort of C-suite consulting about, what are you trying to do with your business, and where does this idea of sustainable development fit within your business? So the organization itself was designed to sort of be a hub. We own a couple of things. We own the organic cotton standards called OE100 and OE Blended. We own the Global Recycle certification I talked about, and a new one called CCC, which we're developing. But really we're a nonprofit, right? We're designed to be this place and space where people can come and work on issues of mutual concern at scale. So we've tried to identify the stakeholder community. It's tough for you to see, but so we're a place and space where people come. We're membership-based, sliding fee scale, and the idea is to create a place and space where people can come together, large and small, and work on issues of mutual concern that they identify as the priorities and then that they work on together. And with that, that's pretty much it for the sort of overarching speech piece. I've had just a couple of questions, and I've kind of rambled for almost an hour straight, so I'm going to stop and just let it flow. What are the things that you're percolating about?
We set up screens that were, we did invest in companies that had poor relationships with the environment, with the community, and with the employees as the main things. And what has happened is as the consciousness